Hello there. It's the 31st of July. Today I'm going to do quite a long piece by Jack Hargreaves again, called The Fellows Who Cut the Hay. This came to me a little while ago, to be fair, but I haven't had much time to do anything lately on YouTube. So the weather's been very catchy here since the end of June, very early part of July, and getting hay or silage crops is difficult, and this is quite an interesting insight into the old ways. The fellows who cut the hay. It is said by some clever people that the English country folk are so wary of personal communication that they bring up the subject of weather on first meeting in order to fend off more intimate matters, a smart crack that could come from only someone who gets his living indoors. For centuries we have known that a day of rain or a fortnight without it can affect a whole season's prosperity, and that in our island climate neither can be reliably predicted. Despite millions of pounds of technology, country people get little comfort from weathermen whose most positive suggestion is, "I think you should take an umbrella," an exclusively urban implement. I sometimes recall with trepidation that Eisenhower sent 350,000 men to the beaches on the advice of a meteorologist. Still, the great gale of October 1987 gave them a warning to get off the game shows and attend to their work. Nowadays, they can't wait to tell us about the wind. Previously, they hardly seemed to mention it. Country people remember the years of their lives by the weather. I, for instance, can bring to life 1921 and 1922 exactly on account of what happened in haytime. Every year in those days, the prosperity of small holdings depended on what happened to the hay. Mother used to say the old man wasn't fit to talk to in haytime. And there is some truth in that. I don't think people quite understand the stress of making forage. Yet the absence of haymaking was one of the things that would astound the old man if he were to drive through today's landscape. Not a lot is made now, and that chiefly for consumption by saddle horses. It is worth recalling what a slice of life it used to be. Even the name of the stuff is interesting. Originally hay meant not grass, but it meant a hedge. Most of the cleared land was in big open fields. Over them and across the waste, the animals grazed freely. Certain small fields were enclosed to keep them out, and it is surprising how many field names on today's farms derived from that. On our place, we had Picket Close and Rams Close. To make a close, you dug a ditch and threw up a bank, on top of which you planted a hedge, a hay. Villages in England like Laira de la Haine, and in Normandy like La Haine de Puit, couldn't tell you exactly, Puits, meant places that had been fenced in. If you know a man called Mr. Hayward, he is descended from the fellow who used to look after the hedges. So the grass that grew protected so it might be cut for the winter was called hay grass. Grandfather always called it that. He used to say, "We've led the hay grass." The old man said, "We've carried the hay." So the language moved on a bit between them, even though one had learned the art from the other. And art it was. Even Freeme's Elements of Agriculture, the old Bible of the craft, was reduced to saying that it depended chiefly on experience and hereditary skill. It is the art of juggling with moisture. If you can put a crop of grass in store at 15 degrees humidity, it will keep its nourishment right through winter. If it's put away just 2 or 3% too moist, it will rot and sometimes set fire to itself by spontaneous combustion. If it is just a bit too dry, it will crumble into a fibrous mass of no worthwhile feed value. First, you have to decide when to cut it. It is fullest of nourishment when the grasses and clovers and vetches are just in bloom. Before that, there will not be enough weight in the crop. A little later, the seed has formed and will be knocked out by the haymaking and left for the birds, and the stems will begin to dry out hard and white. The old man would be out among it 2 or 3 times a day, looking for the point of perfection. After supper, he would be outside staring at the sky and trying to decide whether to cut in the morning. Cutting started at daybreak because all other haymaking tasks had to wait for the dew to dry off. So if the old man said cutting in the morning, we knew we would have to be up to milk in the dark. I can remember the time when the hay was cut with scythes, just the tail end of it. The horse machine mower came in just about when I was born, but took a long time to spread all over. When you first saw scythe mowers at work, you thought the younger men were working much harder than the old. They were, but they were not cutting faster. In fact, the old men got down the row first, because it was a matter of balance and angle and height. Grandfather was one of the best. You could hear the difference without looking. His was a long, even, rasping noise as the stroke cut all the way and made the others sound like chop, chop, chop. He would cut level at a chosen height, no point in picking up dry stalk bottoms, and alter the handles of his sned to fix the amount of stubble. There was no use for boys at scythe mowing, but with the pair of horse mowers a lad was needed on hand all the time. The knife would cut well for only an hour or two and then had to be changed. You had to clamp the knife onto the field gate and get down with the file to file both edges of each of its 50 cutters. When the driver shouted knife, you had to be ready with a sharp one to carry over to him. The machine cut a 4-foot swath of grass, and by the time the dew was off, the swaths would be lying side by side across the field, committed to fate. The word, of course, is one that has gone into the language, but is now often used with its pronunciation degraded. You do not cut a swathe through something, you cut a swath. The rest of the haymaking was carried out with 4 one-horse vehicles known as swath turner, side rake, tedder, and horse rake, subtly employed in different order and sequence. It is perhaps best to imagine them at work on one of the very few occasions when haymaking went perfectly. At the same time, this will remind us how it was done without benefit of machine, in the dimly remembered days of hayforks and sunbonnets. Indeed, while the hay harvest was in progress on the farm, little patches of cottagers' hay could be seen being made on the roadsides and commons and under the apple trees. The swaths that were cut at dawn were left just long enough for the dew to dry off, and then had to be fluffed up so the sun and the breezes could get into the row. The tedder, which was like 4 combs on a revolving axle, would tease up a small row nicely if you set it to turn backwards. Turning forwards in line with the progress of the machine, it would scatter the grass high in the air to land in long, loose heap. In earlier days, the tedding was done by rows of old men, women and children working along with hayforks, a light tined fork with a shoulder-high handles, of the sort that are still seen in stable yards, where they are often now called pitchforks. A pitchfork is another matter, as will be seen later. It has been known for hay to be made in a day when the crop was light and the sun intensely hot, but usually it has to be rolled up again just before the next dew falls in the evening. The side rake does this, rolling the fluffy band up into a single sausage. Only the outside of this will receive the dew, with the sun-blessed hay inside remaining dry. This again was once done by hand, with wooden hay rakes, 2 to a row, usually with the haymakers working fast and quiet to beat the evening, unlike the songs and chatter of the tedding time. Next day it all starts again, and the hay is once more tedded to spend half the day in the breeze. With luck, by early afternoon, the old man may declare it ready to carry, and the side rakes roll it up again. A simple task, really, once in 20 years. In contrast to such ideal times as the infinite number of changes and shifts that must be undertaken to beat the English weather, turning the rows over with the swath turner, rather than risking loosening them out, carting on through the dew of the evening, rather than risk rain that promised before morning. Cutting on a rainy morning on the gamble that it will stop before the hay begins to wilt, keeping the work going on several different cuts that are taking the weather at different stages, with the boys trotting the cobs across the field to ted out one piece and then roll up another. In the last resort, putting it up in cocks. Each drop of rain leaches goodness out of the stuff, and its quality drops. Finally, when there is just little value left, and the rain still comes, it is piled up in conical heaps, with the tops smoothed to shed the continuing rain in the hope of saving something. Well, I've heard the old man say more than once, We'll put it in cocks and go to the pitchers. He was a specialist in taking things on the chin and not moaning. It was a sad phrase to hear. There weren't many farmers at market while June's sun shone. Then one day there would be quite a few turning up. How's the hay then? We cocked it up, which meant we failed and are praying that we may save something of it. Once each cut was dry, and its quality would be good or bad according to how we had nipped the work in between the weather, it was time to carry. In my childhood I worked through the whole history of how this was done. At first the wagon was led between two rows by a boy with the loader on board. 2 men each walked his row, and worked with a giant pitchfork twice his own height, with sprung 18-inch tines and a springy ash handle 12 feet long. The fork was pushed along the row to build up a haycock 5 foot high, and then the loader turned the handle over and leapt in the air for his weight to drive the points in. You could hear the crunch. Then he turned round, put his shoulder halfway along the handle, and levered the whole lot in the air. He held it there, balanced, with one hand at his waist, the other stretched high above, and staggered to put it up just where the loader called for it. The weight and pressure must be evenly spread along the wagon if a big load were to travel without tumbling. When the last pitch was up, the boy would unhook the great hay rope and pitch it over from side to side, from cleat to cleat, and when the loader had settled it in, tie on. Then, at a shout from above, the men would throw their pitchforks in a wide arc to land on their points far enough away to be seen from the top. Once they were wobbling there, the man on top would slide right down the back of the load. You could tell a loader by the shine on his pants and his wide leather leg yokes done up tight to stop his trousers running up. Then came the lad's responsibility. It was not too much to lead the wagons across one field to a rick building the other side, but if the work was going on half a mile away at the rickyard, it was another matter. An extra horse would be taken off the hedge and chained onto the front. Then, with the curve up to the gate and the turn into the track and the bends and slopes from then on, it was heart in the mouth all the way. And some way along you'd meet another boy with an empty wagon. If you didn't meet him then, it meant they'd stopped work at the yard, and it was beaver time. We had 2 outdoor meals on haymaking, never sat on a chair after breakfast. The first was called beaver, and the second tea. Beaver comes from bouvoir, the Norman French for to drink. The hinged front of a helmet that can be raised is called the beaver, for the same reason. Mother used to pack splendid food into the apple basket covered with white cloth, including her famous pasties that she made in dozens at haytime. The casual workers brought whatever they had for beaver. Old Jim Haines was the man to watch. When we'd put the nose bags round the horses, Jim would take out his lamb's foot knife and wipe it on his trousers. Then he would cover thick slices of bread with a cold bacon rasher, to be covered in turn with a deep layer of rings cut from a big raw onion. On top again went a piece of cheese cut to fit. The result was at least 2 inches thick, and he would shove the corner into his mouth and anchor it there with his 2 or 3 remaining teeth. To make further progress, it was necessary to cut the whole thing off at the lips with the lamb's foot knife. He was always happy at haytime. The brewery at Rosham used to drop a niner in the hedge every 2 days. Nobody showed any signs of it. They lost too much in perspiration. We kept up loading with pitchforks until Jim Haines died. He died at work, quite suddenly and shockingly. A visitor from town was giving a hand clearing up the rows behind the pitchers with a small hay fork. When the load was topped up and the pitchers tossed their forks out to stand in view, he leaned against the back of the load, just where Jim came sliding down on his backside. He would never have believed that any of us in the field, from our disciplined childhood onward, had not learned to do things properly. After he went, we got a hay loader. He always said he would never work with one because it pitched all the hay up at the back of the wagon, and he couldn't call his shots to build properly. It was a tall roller conveyor that was driven by its own wheels and picked up a whole row neatly. When the load was up, The lad would back up the thill horse an inch and lift the thing off its tow bar. At this time there also came hay sweeps, great flat wooden forks with iron-shod points. They lay flat on the ground like an egg fork and were dragged by one horse each side, later pushed from behind by a tractor. They were no good to us because we snapped the tines. On smoother ground they went right across the field, gathering a mountain and delivering it to the rick. In this fever of mechanization we also bought a rick elevator to go with the hay loader. It was like an escalator and could be wound up to deliver higher and higher as the rick grew. It was driven by an old horse walking round in a circle, one who'd done his time pulling heavy loads. He quite liked the job, except that he kept falling asleep. The boy who was clearing round the rick and picking up the pieces had to spring into action when the whole thing stopped. "What are you doing down there? Wake the horse up." The ricks went up like the loads, though much higher, and with the weight carefully spread so that when they sank square and the ridge clean and sharp to shed moisture. We rarely got up there in a day, so with the slightest chance of rain, the huge heavy rick sheet had to be pulled up on a sort of rugger goalpost frame and then hung around the edges with old iron from the barn. That was it for the day, except that the cows were now bursting to be milked in the dark. In the end it would all be over with just time to sit down before harvest, after which old Jim would come down with straw to thatch the settled ridges against the winter. With one of them he would usually win the district thatching prize, together with the hedge laying, to say nothing of being placed in the hurdle making, which he also thought he should have won each year. There would be ricks in each of the fields, all waiting for the hay dealer. When he came to buy, he would bring a long iron rod, barbed at the end like a fish hook. He would push it right into the middle of the rick and then pull it out by its ring to get a sample from the middle and sniff it. Good hay smells beautiful, and bad hay has no smell, but poor hay that has been heated up can sometimes produce a scent that will fool some people. The old man wasn't beyond trying it on. He too had a hay rod, and I've known him push it into a rick in which he'd risked a bit of moisture, then spit on its end to see if it was hot. Once he took it too far. We had to pull a whole rick down and spread it to avoid a fire. In the yard there would be an army of ricks behind the byre. They would feed the animals through the winter. We had to cut the air out in tall square columns with a hay knife. Don't speak of it. You see them hanging on walls of pubs. People say that's a hay knife. I remember them. If they did, I think they would turn silently away. Working in a settled rick with a hay knife, particularly up a ladder, would make a good punishment for a penal camp. It has stirred me to remember it, and I know a lot of older people will read with emotion. Anyway, it's a good thing to record how to do it, lest oil gives out and we find we have forgotten. It's quite impossible. I am quite sure, for instance, that we in England forgot some centuries ago how to make silage. There was none about when I was young, yet James Fisher told me when he and Peter Scott went to the interior of Iceland to ring pinkfoot geese, they found many stone silage pits that had been used 1,000 years ago in that land so unsuitable for haymaking. You'd think it must have come over to us with the Vikings. However, we discovered in the war that a rackety, smelly and sometimes poisonous system had taken the place of haymaking. It works not by controlling moisture, but by exactly controlling putrefaction. It can be made independent of weather, but you can't make it in quality without diesel. I thought that I should never see the old summertime sights again. However, as I drove across Germany in 1945, when the Wehrmacht were cooped up in Schleswig-Holstein, I haven't got that right, there were the German women and children, sunbonnets and all, trying to make hay with forks and wooden rakes. But Montgomery had an idea of what was needed. The first thing he did was to organize a great convoy, called Exercise Barleycorn, to bring the German country lads out from behind the barbed wire and take them back to their villages. I know it was long, but I think it's rather a wonderful insight into country life as it was. Bye for now.